Chapter 9. Frank. As he marched to the war games, Frank replayed the day in his mind. He couldn't believe how close to death he'd come. That morning, on sentry duty, before Percy showed up, Frank had almost told Hazel his secret. The two of them had been standing for hours in the chilly fog, watching the commuter traffic on Highway 24. Hazel had been complaining about the cold. "I'd give anything to be warm," she said, her teeth chattering. "I wish we had a fire." Even with her armor on, she looked great. Frank liked the way her cinnamon toast-colored hair curled around the edges of her helmet, and the way her chin dimpled when she frowned. She was tiny compared to Frank, which made him feel like a big, clumsy ox. He wanted to put his arms around her to warm her up, but he'd never do that. She'd probably hit him, and he'd lose the only friend that he had at camp. I could make a really impressive fire, he thought. Of course, it would only burn for a few minutes, and then I'd die. It was scary that he even considered it. Hazel had that effect on him. Whenever she wanted something, he had the irrational urge to provide it. He wanted to be the old-fashioned knight riding to her rescue, which was stupid, as she was way more capable at everything than he was. He imagined what his grandmother would say. Frank Zang riding to the rescue. Ha! He'd fall off his horse and break his neck. Hard to believe it'd only been 6 weeks since he'd left his grandmother's house. 6 weeks since his mom's funeral. Everything had happened since then. Wolves arriving at his grandmother's door, the journey to Camp Jupiter, the weeks he'd spent in the 5th cohort trying to be not to be a complete failure. Through it all, he kept the half-buried piece of firewood wrapped in a cloth in his coat pocket. "Keep it close," his grandmother had warned. "As long as it is safe, you are safe." The problem was that it burned so easily. He remembered the trip from south from Vancouver, when the temperature dropped below freezing near Mount Hood. Frank had brought out the piece of tinder and held it in his hands, imagining how nice it would be to have some fire. Immediately the charred end blazed with a searing yellow flame. It lit up the night and warmed Frank to the bone, but he could feel his life slipping away, as if he were being consumed rather than the wood. He'd thrust the flame into a snowbank. For a horrible moment, it kept burning. When it finally went out, Frank got his panic under control. He wrapped the piece of wood and put it back in his coat pocket, determined not to bring it out again. But he couldn't forget it. It was as though someone had said, "Whatever you do, don't think about that stick bursting into flame." So of course, that's all he thought about. On sentry duty with Hazel, he would try to take his mind off it. He loved spending time with her. He asked her about growing up in New Orleans, but she got edgy at his questions, so they made small talk instead. Just for fun, they tried to speak French to each other. Hazel had some Creole blood from her mother's side. Frank had taken French in school. Neither of them was very fluent, and Louisiana French was so different from Canadian French, it was almost impossible to converse. When Frank asked Hazel how her beef was feeling today, and she replied that his shoe was green, they decided to give up. Then, Percy Jackson had arrived. Sure, Frank had seen kids fight monsters before. He'd fought plenty of them himself on his journey from Vancouver, but he'd never seen Gorgons. He'd never seen a goddess in person, and the way Percy had controlled that little Tibber, wow. Frank wished he had powers like that. He could still feel the Gorgon's claws pressing into his arms, and the smell of their snaky breath, like dead mice and poison. If not for Percy, those grotesque hags would have carried him away. He'd be a pile of bones in the back of a bargain lot by now. After the incident at the river, Raina had sent Frank to the armory, which had given him way too much time to think. While he polished swords, he remembered Juno warning them to unleash death. Unfortunately, Frank had a pretty good idea of what the goddess meant. He had tried to hide his shock when Juno had appeared, but she looked exactly like his grandmother had described, right down to the goat-skin cape. "She chose your path years ago," grandmother had told him, "and it will not be easy." Frank glanced at his bow in the corner of the armory. He'd feel better if Apollo would claim him as a son. Frank had already been sure that Apollo was his godly parent and would speak up for him on his 16th birthday. But that had passed 2 weeks ago. 16 was an important milestone for Romans. It had been Frank's first birthday at camp, but nothing had happened. Now Frank hoped that he'd be claimed on the Feast of Fortuna, which, from now what Juno had said, they'd be in a battle for their lives on that day. His father had to be Apollo. Archery was the only thing Frank was good at. Years ago, his mother had told him that their family name, Zhang, meant master of bows in Chinese. That must have been a hint about his dad. Frank put down his polishing rags. He looked at the ceiling. "Please, Apollo, if you are my dad, tell me, I want to be an archer like you.